Dear IE community, I have the pleasure today to welcome as our guest Rolf Strom-Olsen, Professor Rolf Strom-Olsen, Professor of Humanities at IE University, known for his many courses in critical thinking, for courses that apply the humanities to business or to any of the other disciplines that we have at IE University. I think it's safe to say that he is one of our best. He is a favorite professor to so many people across time. He might not admit it, but I know it's true. And he's absolutely amazing. And it's fantastic to have him here today. So welcome, Rolf. How are you?
Well, thank you very much for that glowing but undeserved introduction.
So humble as well, we might say. So the question that I wanted to share with you and to put it out there is this. If we think about these days, these times that we're living in a minute, I mean, we could make a pretty long list of difficult challenges, massive challenges, disruptions. For example, we could talk about the Great Resignation. We could talk about social divide, whether that be class-based, whether that is race-based, whether that is gender-based, or whatever it might be. We could certainly throw in the pandemic. We might add in climate change for good measure, global security. We could say the nature of money is changing. Will we even have money in the normal form in the future? So we can make that long list. And would you add anything to that list, by the way?
No, I think that's it's a good starting pack.
Okay, so that's a good list of major challenges that we face in our world today. So one could say that the pace of change maybe has accelerated, that the depth of disruption has deepened. And my first question is that really true? I mean, we all like to think that our time is harder and more difficult and more challenging than other times, but you're a historian. So I'm wondering, do you think that that's true?
I think it is, and I think it isn't true. I mean, that's the classic sort of hedge answer. But I think there is a challenge that we face, which is really without, in the modern context, without precedent, and that is climate change. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I think the larger sense of where our society is, the tremendous discord that we see politically, the divides that have opened up, this kind of turbulence that's taking place inside of our societies about the kind of standard, a sort of a standard model that doesn't seem to hold anymore. That I don't think is new. I just think that's the old story. I think you probably go back to any number of periods and ask people how they felt, and they probably would have seen something of the same thing. I mean, the Napoleonic Wars, which seemed to be catastrophic for people. But I think, probably for our purposes, think about like the 1930s. You have the Great Depression, which feels to many people like the failure of capitalism itself, right? You have 25% unemployment, 50% underemployment, labor markets aren't working, credit markets aren't working. So there's all these questions, ideological questions, political questions about the nature of the system. Can it even hold? People are experimenting with radical alternatives. We tend to forget, but Marxism or communism was considered a viable political alternative, even in places like the United States, Mexico, Canada, France, Italy, and so on. So, and I think that just reflected people's sense of being trapped in a time that was very, very difficult. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the rise in the 1930s of some of the most barbarous regimes that would turn out to be part of our human history. So I think times looked very bleak back then. And I'm sure if you would talk to somebody and say 1933, 34, how are you feeling? The answer was
38, 39.
Yeah, not great. And of course, it got a lot worse before it got better. And I think those would have felt like long years. I think the decade between, say, 1935 and 1945 was a long decade. But a decade in the course of even a human lifetime isn't actually that long. And if you think about all of the things that happened and the system that came out of that, and then we tend to think of the post-40s and the 50s, the golden age of capitalism, a new kind of relationship between firms and labor, regulations introduced into the economy, and an entirely new political system, right, anchored by the idea of a kind of global institutionalism, the United Nations, and all that. So, I think that we face some serious problems, and there's no question about it. But I think if we can go back, we can see that in fact there are many other instances in even our recent past where people have also probably felt equally beleaguered. Now, I think the one difference is that climate change is not an endogenous problem of how human societies choose to arrange their affairs. It's an exogenous problem because the climate doesn't care how many institutional fixes we come up with. And so that is, I think that is a separate challenge in terms of how we need to address it. And I think for climate change, we do need a truly historic approach, because I don't think we can simply say, oh, well, this is what we've seen, this is what we've seen many times before. So I think that.
You think there's I wonder if is there a scale argument to be made in the sense, and you mentioned the Napoleonic Wars, you mentioned, which were in some sense, from a global standpoint, regional, obviously. You mentioned the 1930s, the Great Depression, the onset of World War II, which was obviously more global, being a world war, but still not all of the world. But do you think that the scale of these disruptions, or I like your word turbulence, do you think the scale of this turbulence has increased because we're just more global, we're more connected, and that sort of gives us this feeling that maybe our times are more turbulent than others, or not really?
Well, I think with respect to climate change, obviously it's a global problem, right? I mean, part of the injustice of climate change is that the people who had the least to do with it are going to suffer first and worse. I think that it's, we obviously have an unprecedented capacity for global cooperation. It may not feel like that with Russian troops staring down at the Ukrainian border and so on. But there is obviously a mechanism in place for global cooperation, such as has never existed really in modern human civilized history. So we do have, I think the mechanics are there possibly for addressing it. But I mean, the scale of the problem is just massive. That's the issue. And there's no, we can't fix this by changing the social compact as we maybe have done in the past. We need real technological innovation as well as social and economic fixes to this issue. So I myself, I can't think of another issue like climate change in human history, that afflicted. It's possible you could say maybe the Cold War, because I mean we have mutually assured destruction. All-out nuclear war would have certainly affected lots of people, and there was obviously a lot of anxiety about that. But in the end of the day, it's the decision by one human hand to punch the button. So we have a kind of agency there. I think part of the problem with climate change is, as we're seeing in the last couple of years, is the role of human agency in shaping what our future is going to look like ecologically seems to be getting smaller and smaller. And I think that that's part of the problem that we face. How do we deal with a problem where our own agency is kind of wrapped up into these larger exogenous changes? So I see that as a big problem.
So maybe climate change itself it fits in the more unprecedented category, and because of that we don't feel like we can control it. We don't have the agency that you mentioned. It's maybe that fits in the kind of, these times are different than past times. But it was interesting you mentioned in some of these difficult, turbulent periods, you mentioned that they were followed by periods of enlightenment, or at least better periods. If you look back to probably a longer chain of these turbulent times that you have in your head as a historian, I mean, anything we could learn or expect now, given that we are in tough times, and what do we have to look forward to, and what might be the impetus that impels that change for us?
I mean, I have a certain confidence that I mean,
I'm asking you to predict as a historian.
I mean, which I shouldn't do. I will say, I mean, I have a certain confidence that systems that are broken do get repaired, and often the fix is, it's a real fix. So, for example, in the last 150 years, say, we've solved. I mean, shouldn't say solved, but I mean, it's not. You don't have to go back that far before many Western countries had things like legal slaveholding. And essentially deprive 50% of the population of really any civil rights at all. And we have now recognized, as part of the basic social contract to which we wish to adhere, that both of those are abhorrent to our modern political sensibility. So certainly there are many strides left to be taken in terms of bringing about anything like a society that brings, that has justice for all of its people. But we've gone quite a ways from thinking that that's totally normal. Of course, you have slaves. Of course, women don't get to vote, etc. To thinking that to having a kind of a 180 in terms of our general approach. So, without saying that we're in some sort of nirvana, I think nonetheless it shows us that we are capable of correcting the problems that are there. So I do think that if we look at the issues that surround us, and there do seem to be many about questions of basic economic justice, social justice, the problem of opportunity, the North-South divide, et cetera. Yeah, I'm not too worried. I think that many of those problems will sort themselves out just through the kind of ongoing function of the sort of social dialogues that we've always seen across history. As far as like specific, I'm not sure, for example, like when the Roman Empire fell, I'm not sure how people felt. Although there's an argument that says people probably felt a lot better because they were no longer working for distant emperors in Rome, but now could work for themselves. So sometimes even the events we interpret as catastrophic may have felt different to people on the ground.
And when you think about the drivers of the end, let's say, the end to these tumultuous periods of time that when what's driven them, I mean, you could argue, I guess, at least in some of these tumultuous times, that there was big swings. So you had some extremism and big things happen, and that was that revolution, for example, a major movement, people in the streets rising up against something they didn't like. So in some sense, violence to end some of these periods of time, and then obviously some tumult post-violence leading to then stability. But do you see that? I mean, do you think the world is a more enlightened place, and that we're not going to see these extreme acts that are necessary to make these changes happen, or do you think maybe not?
I mean,
does it require? I guess my question is, do you think that sometimes getting people to move when they see things as kind of bad, but not so bad that they're not willing to act, and that actually leads to complacency, and then things just change slower, and then you need this extreme form of reaction, or not really?
I don't. I mean, well, that's an interesting question. No, I would be surprised if this somehow has to be sorted out through some kind of violent, I don't know, like a systemic violent overthrow of the system, as they used to say in the 60s. I mean, for one thing, we're the very fact that we're globalized means that everybody kind of has a stake in the system. So, violence itself is going to be disruptive to all actors in that sense, right? I mean, we saw that in the pandemic. We can't isolate one part of the world from another part of the world. And so just pure questions of self-interest mean that we need to find different ways to solve our problems. And I think the easiest way to solve our problems is through things like cooperation. So that's why I have some idea or belief that we will be able to leverage global cooperation. I know that, when you sit there and you see the failures of like COP24 and 25, it doesn't feel like global cooperation. It feels like a bunch of people taking flights to get together for a good time. But that's what global cooperation looks like. It happens very slowly. And from the point of view of any, year to year, it doesn't seem to be doing much. But if you take it over a 10, 20, 30-year period, you'll start to see these kinds of changes. And I think there's a lot of historical precedent for that. I think the other thing is that I think we have different ways of leveraging thinking now that we didn't have before. I think that, we need thought solutions to these problems, right? We need to be challenging the basic assumptions about how we live, how we organize our societies, questioning some of the basic premises that we've inherited as a sort of default economic thinking. I think a lot of this stuff needs to be brought into play. But unlike, say, a previous era where it was, capitalists and Marxists sort of going at it, I think we can be more nuanced about it. I think we have the capacity to be sort of beyond ideology and instead start thinking, okay, well, what are the features of a system? What are the features of the system that we need to change? How should we change it? What are we trying to obtain, to achieve? And I think I would identify a lot of that actually at the level of a new style of thought leadership. I think that hopefully will be emerging to sort of guide us forward as far as where we need to go.
I mean, what you were saying made me think about, so there's data, I guess, from the OECD and probably many other sources showing that trust in leadership, faith in leadership is at pretty much historical bottom. I mean, you ask people about their belief in institutions and the ability of leaders and their institutions to actually make things happen. Like, you sort of joked about the COP meetings, right, is not really doing anything. And I think that's the sense that people have. So I wonder, you have that going on. And then you simultaneously, though, we have a lot of, I'm not sure what the right term would be, I'll make one up, but, kind of bottom up grassroots enablement in the sense that people can connect to each other, through digital means. We've got, things like blockchain coming out. We've got, all sorts of new ways of self-organizing that makes me wonder whether, is government going to be outdated in a certain in the sense of solving certain types of problems? And are we as citizens, whether it's in a nation or globally, going to band together and say, well, nothing's happening at the top, so let's make it happen from the bottom? Is there something interesting going on there that you see happening?
Usually when hard decisions have to be taken, politicians are not the ones to take them. So that, I think, I think that's a very perceptive. I think what you're saying is very perceptive. I also think we should put the market in there. I think my former students might be surprised I'm saying this, but I think that markets are tremendous fonts for coming up with ingenious solutions. And so, and that I see as a kind of a bottom-up approach. Give you an example. Trump, when he was president, one of the things he wanted to do was to roll back some of the environmental regulations concerning automobile emissions and the like, right? It was to free up the car industry. And the car makers weren't interested. They said, basically, we don't want to see ourselves as polluters. We're not that kind of, we don't want to bring that kind of citizenship into the marketplace. And so the market responded essentially according to its own logic, which fit with a kind of larger social logic. Now, I don't want to make too much of that one particular example, but it does remind us that that markets are these sort of a bottom-up system can indeed bring about new ways of thinking, and then in a way the politics respond to that, right? So rather than being led by the politicians, as it were, reflect the changes that are taking place. I do have to say, the problems of climate change are happening quickly. So how much time we have in order to affect these changes, I think is unclear. But almost what I think is clear is it's less time than we thought we had. So I do think that there's a sense of urgency now to some of this stuff that maybe we didn't feel. You and I are of an age. So certainly when we were in our 20s or 30s, we didn't feel like this was something we needed to address, but the urgency wasn't there. And one thing I'm seeing in the last, even within the decade, is that a lot of urgency is now attaching to that. And that urgency you're right, doesn't have to express itself through political action. It can express itself in other ways. It can express itself through grassroots action, or it can express itself through sort of citizenship decision-making at the level of markets. That, and I think that could be a very powerful tool for ushering in whatever the new system is that we're going to need to address these issues.
Yeah, so I guess it's those of us in democracy, we've always been able to vote, to exercise our influence with a vote, a political vote. In market economies, we can exercise our influence by voting with our money, with our currency, and what we buy. And
our ethics, essentially, right?
Our ethics, that's where I was headed. I was thinking that in some ways now what we're seeing is people are voting with their talent in the sense of. Large numbers of people. I've been talking to our alumni and graduating students, and they're saying, I don't want to work for company X. They don't align with my values. They don't align with my purpose. I won't work for them. And we're talking top people that these companies want. And so I see companies scrambling to define or redefine their purpose, how they communicate that purpose, and to actually show some fire behind the smoke. So it's not just talk. So maybe the war for talent will manifest itself in positive changes as well.
Yeah, I'm picking up on the same thing. As it feels like there's a veritable transmogrification of how people see a career from sort of the Gen X to whatever gen we're in now, Z. Absolutely. In terms of where people's priorities are, and as you say, looking for a fit that's more than just about remuneration and advancement, but also about values. And I think also I see people sort of interested in preserving a kind of flexibility as well in terms of who they want to be. So that notion that you like, it's like when we were young, you get a career and you stick with it. And instead we're seeing, I think people don't want to be put in boxes like that anymore, which honestly, that's great.
Well, let me wrap up and with one final question, which I like to ask. You know our community quite well. You've been at IE for a very long time. Any thoughts, quick thoughts on helping us as managers, as leaders, or colleagues out there in the working world, how we deal with the world and the turbulence, as you said. How do we deal with turbulence? Any thoughts on turbulence management, so to speak?
But read more. That's what I tell my students: read more. Which is not a very helpful answer. I think that I think perspective helps, right? I think we need a perspective on what it is we're trying to achieve, and this is part of the problem of climate change in a way, is that it helps us focus a little bit on that kind of underlying goal of what's the purpose here. And in a way, as part of a business school community, we're attached to a language that is pretty much the old school economics of invest in the fundamentals, build up your infrastructure, and look for sort of steady year-over-year economic growth, and then have a healthy economy. And the problem with that is that the healthier our economy, the unhealthier our ecosystem, because our economy is based on an 80% carbon emitting fuel technology, and those are just incompatible. So we need to start challenging some of these core assumptions. I think we need to start challenging, for example, the idea that sort of expanded economic consumption is the only way for us to sort of see ourselves into the future. And I think that takes creativity, thought, and perspective. So I've always thought that IE was very good at building up good thought leadership inside of its programs. So not just people who are well trained in optimizing equity versus debt financing, but thinking through what are the issues that are going to be facing people tomorrow, both in the workforce and sort of more broadly. And I think we should double down on that. I think that's the most important skill set probably going forward, is to have that sort of intellectual perspective, that intellectual architecture that allows you to push through the kind of nuts and bolts that we tend to think of as business, and instead say, well, what's the bigger picture, and how do we align ourselves so that, say, 10, 20, 30 years from now, what we're doing today is going to be consistent with what we need to be doing then, so that we end up moving in the right direction.
So I think we have a learning moment. Everybody that's done business school knows about the 4 Ps of marketing. Yeah, I think we now have the 2 Ps of Rolf Strom-Olsen, which are perspective and purpose. And I think, to be honest, I think that is really, really great advice. Perspective, I think we lose perspective. We get busy in our jobs, right? And I think for many people, the pandemic, one of the positives of the pandemic is that it made a lot of people step back and say, what is my life about? What am I doing? I'm doing work. I have my life. How are those 2 things integrated? And then ask your second P, purpose. What's the meaning in all this? How does it fit with values, with the larger sense of purpose? And I think those 2 things actually are very synergetic, right? The purpose and perspective. Focusing on purpose, doing things that have meaning, actually gets us out of our day-to-day and gives us perspective. And then when we have that perspective, I think we actually want more purpose. Yeah. I think it's an upward sort of virtuous cycle.
They interlock in that way.
Yeah, very much so. So I think we have something. The 2 Ps of our beloved Professor Rolf Strom-Olsen, perspective and purpose. And I think it's something to think about. And then just to close, I don't think it was, you said, it's not saying much to say read, but a lot of us are not reading anymore. A lot of people are not reading, right? Or listening even to podcasts. So I think we need to do that more, right? And the size of the size of consumption of text or audio is shrinking, and sometimes we got to read a little bit more to dig in deeper, don't we?
We need better information. It's a great paradox. As information is democratized and become more available to everybody, the quality of information has declined. Our capacity to be well-informed, and not just well-informed in the sense of knowing a lot, but knowing effectively has diminished. And it's clearly, we were not prepared. You and I, who grew up with before there was internet, I remember that the internet was always going to be this great revolution and so on, which indeed it has been. But we were not prepared for what it was going to create. And people need, I think, to sort of remember that it's kind of incumbent upon them as curators of their own knowledge base to be responsible for what it is that they know, and to learn how to find out what they need to know. And reading is usually a good base of that. Although my students usually complain I make them read too much, so I should be careful.
So final message. Read critically, think critically about what you're reading, and and that is another driver of possible perspective and purpose in getting you out of your day to day and aligning with something bigger. That's important. Thank you very much, Rolf. Thanks to everyone in our IE community who is tuning into this video. It's always a pleasure to have one of our top professors sharing his thoughts on the world, and in this case, some really interesting things for us to think about. So thanks very much. And thank you so much, Lee. Thank you. Thank all of you for joining in.